let's crack on. And I've got a very distinguished panel to pull all this apart this afternoon. So from the end, we have Simon Chin, double Oscar-winning documentary producer and co-founder of Lightbox. We have Jo Clinton-Davis, ITV's controller of Factual. We have Chris Shaw, editorial director at ITM Productions. And we have Laura Fleury, who's going to get this right, Senior Vice President and Head of Programming for A&E International. Is that right? So welcome all. And well, let's start with that first question. I mean, are we really here just fascinated with the wicked? Is that where true crime starts? And is that a good place to start? Are we morally in charge here?
I am fascinated with that stuff. Darker the better, nastier the better, scarier the better. I would classify it as sort of the evil that men do. So,
and women.
Yeah, and women. Yeah, actually, I like the women killers more than the men killers. But there is another dimension, of course, which is about the sort of the human condition and why, and all our capacities for wrongdoing, our motivation. So all human life is captured in its most extreme form when a crime is committed, the good and the bad, I think. And that's why it's such an enduring subject of fascination.
And Jo, is it the power of that storytelling, do you think, that makes it such a popular genre?
Yeah, I mean, actually, looking at that, who says the role of talent is questionable in true crime? I mean, what he added, Hitchcock, to that clip, you know, though hopefully we'll get onto talent. But absolutely, it's deep, it's dark, it's visceral, it's popular. There's a sort of sense of why now, but it was ever thus. You know, it started in the Garden of Eden. Was Eve a victim of a miscarriage of justice? You know, and we've been doing crime on ITV for a long time, before the sort of Netflix boom, if you like. We were making series, big blockbuster series, in prisons, you know, Holloway, Strangeways, Aylesbury, Killer Women, the Mafia, because we know that there is something that I think is really universal. I think you mentioned mankind. It's in all of us. It fascinates all of us. It speaks to all of us. We think, do we have a dark side in ourselves? We like to see some, you know, obviously there's a whole sort of raft of miscarriages of justice, but we like to see, you know, the goodies, the baddies. It's the whole sort of Western phenomenon as well. And it takes you into sort of worlds that are deep. It's not just about murders, it's about police, it's about forensics, it's about justice system. Crime can embody a lot of iterations, if you like. And I think the other thing about crime is that we talk about it as a genre, and there's something, I suppose, generic about it. But really successful crime shows have something at their heart, a USP. Each crime, each mise-en-scène, if you like, has a sort of distinctive quality that you can go deep into, and it's that both that unique thing and the universal fascination that I think is a potent combination.
And Simon, with your work in terms of storytelling, the big crime stories are great dramas as well. I mean, that's something that you're very much looking at.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what I was going to say was that Hitchcock is a master of the fictional crime genre, and we all sort of grew up with that genre. We all love it. The kind of fascinating thing is that people also love true crime. But I guess the kind of opportunity that sort of feels to me like it has emerged is sort of taking the tropes of Hitchcock and the fictional genre and crime movies and sort of applying those to non-fiction. And you know, I think you know there have been several sort of trailblazers in that area. I'm thinking of sort of Errol Morris and The Thin Blue Line, which was, I guess, late 80s. You know, who really, I mean, I guess what he was, you know, he sort of revolutionized the non-fiction genre, both in terms of his kind of filmmaking vision, but also his sort of journalistic ambition. You know. And so it's been, you know, it's been happening for a while. I mean, The Imposter, which I was involved in, was an absolutely kind of deliberate attempt to sort of take the tropes of film noir a kind of past tense story, and try and make a documentary that felt in every respect like, you know, Hitchcock or something. So it's kind of highly manipulated. And I think that you know, that I think is the direction that the genre generally is moving in.
And Laura, the US has long been, you know, a real home of true crime, and many of the great series. I mean, you were obviously responsible for the first 48, which is one of those really classic series. Is the American true crime, is it healthy? Are we are we in a golden age of true crime programming?
Well, I think that I think one of the things about true crime is that it's, as Joe said, it's crime that is based on real stories. That are real stories is to me even bigger than a genre, because there are so many different sub-genres within that. And there are so many different ways of telling those stories. So there's the very traditional core crime of, you know, there was a murder, there's recreation, there are interviews, and then it's resolved in the end, and there's something very satisfying in that, and that's a certain type of viewer. And then there's a lot of the stuff that I think we're all, that everyone's aware of internationally, which are the stories that really transcend and that are touching on what I think all crime stories do, and it is very different to what I think a lot of people feel about crime, which is I think there's something ultimately positive about why people are interested in crime. I don't think people are interested in prurience. I don't think people want to think that they are in a better place than someone else. I think it's really about, it is the edge of humanity. It is humanity at its extremes. It is the core of the Bible stories and Shakespeare. And why do we care about that stuff? Because we want to believe that in this world of chaos, that there's a way to overcome. Bad things happen, and you can still get your kid back from the kidnapper, or you might be able to get yourself away from a serial killer or whatever. So I think there's a sense of, it sort of gives a sense of either restoring justice in the world or balance in the world. And what I think is really, and that's traditionally been the true crime space. How that's evolved and where that's gotten really exciting, I think, for those of us who have been doing true crime for a long time, is that there were so many stories that wouldn't work on TV because not enough people would watch them. And I think now that there's the mistrust of the institutions, there's much more of a willingness to spend 6 hours, and we can debate on what platform they might be willing to watch 6 or 10 hours on one case, but to really get into those cases of wrongful conviction and things like that, where you couldn't do that. Like we couldn't do those on A&E because nobody would watch them, and now people are really interested in really unpicking and not necessarily trusting the police. So,
although the wrongful conviction, yes, there is a sort of skein of programs about wrongful conviction, but wrongful conviction can come out in other ways as well. I mean, we did a series of killer women with Piers Morgan just recently. Some were just extraordinary, psychotic people, and you realise, my God, don't let them out. Even Piers was scared, and that's saying something. And some were, there was one woman called the Hiccup Killer in the run, and it was clear that it was a sort of miscarriage of justice, that she was going to be in prison for the rest of her life, not having pulled the trigger, because she was an infamous character who'd been on morning television hiccuping, and she was made an example of. So there is, you can blend these different elements into your mainstream crime offering without sort of hiving off and saying this is the miscarriage of justice bit.
But I think you're right, Laura's right, and there are a number of categories. I sort of alluded to one, which is the sort of heavily crafted, but you're right. I think one of the other really interesting sort of emerging categories is the sort of highly sort of novelistic sort of crime story. I mean, OJ, in many ways being the sort of the gold standard, the Oscar-winning OJ series, which I think was kind of fascinating in the sense that it kind of layered other sort of rich themes onto a kind of propulsive crime story, so that it's sort of in the end, I don't remember it as a crime series as such, even though that's what it was. It was actually a series about race in America, the kind of intersection between race, celebrity. It had so many rich themes that it became something else.
And they could do a drama version of it too.
Right.
Equally good, I thought.
Yeah,
in its own way.
You can absolutely plunder the familiar, can't you? As long as you bring something fresh in terms of the perspective.
You do need a lot
of
plot, though.
You do need a lot of plot.
And, or a lot of detail.
Yeah.
And I think, the challenge in a way is to believe that the audience can absorb that detail and get in the zone and get into the story and want more information. That seems to me the sort of the drawing in appeal of what I would call sort of the new wave, longer form crime stuff, whether it's, fact-based drama or doc. Once you've got a viewer hooked on a story, and provided you tell the story brilliantly, and there is enough twists and turns to keep you coming back hour after hour, week after week.
But originally the crime show was, to some extent, schedule filling. There were, certainly in UK broadcasters, there was a feeling of doing a lot of cheap crime. Oh, yeah. God forbid. And now it seems that there is a more complicated relationship with the genre. But is revelation, there's always a need for revelation? Do you think that's something that is happening more recently, that we need, or rather than just retelling a story, or retelling a story through the traditional archive interview route, that we now need revelation, we need new things to come out of all these shows, which is more pressure?
I think it depends on what type of audience you're bringing in. I think ID is built on going after a particular type of core crime viewer. I think for people who aren't just doing crime, I think you have to have something fresh to bring to the table. That's what we did a bunch of OJ docs that we thought were great too, and although we didn't win an Oscar, but it was because we had new stuff. Because why would you go and tell that story as a documentary again, if you didn't have something new? So I think because the audience can get have so many different places they can get stories, that that's my opinion. You do have to have something fresh.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. Go on, Chris.
I was going to say that there are lots of definitions of something new. I know that sounds a bit specious, but in an ideal world, you kind of unravel a story, prove a man's innocence or guilt. Our interview with the murderer, we had a kicker at the end there, which we didn't even know about until about a week before we were delivered the bloody thing. So that's luck and hard work. But there are other kinds of new as well. There's new in terms of people speaking for the first time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the passage of time allows relatives, victims to say things they've never said before. Okay, well, let's have a look at a clip from a show actually which your company produced, Chris, Sarah Payne, A Mother's Story. Let's have a look at that clip. It's important, and it's a talk. I think the victim or the perpetrator's point of view is interesting here. Should we be looking from the victim's point of view, or should we understand the perpetrator? What are the dangers in those two kind of approaches? I think you can do it from a multifaceted approach, depending on what the story is. I mean, we've got something similar. There is something about the pull of a familiar story done differently. We've got what we hope will be a franchise called The Killer Interview, working title, which is about how police nail the killers through the forensic process of the interview technique. But the first episode in that's going out in our new Crime and Punishment season, The Appetite for Crime and Punishment, is the Becky Watts story. Now, the Becky Watts story is familiar in a way, but we've never seen the extent of the police footage and the nature of the police interrogation, but you wouldn't want to do the Becky Watts story without talking and the blessing, if you like, of the family. And that's extraordinary because Becky Watts was murdered by her stepbrother and girlfriend. So actually the family dynamic is incredibly important, and the victim issues are incredibly important, and what's it like to be living as the sort of father of the victim and the stepmother. So there's a dynamic there, there's a dynamic about the police process, and it gives you a holistic view with still the narrative drive of the cat and mouse game. But in using those stories, are we exploiting the relatives? Is the family involved in it? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with those in the stories?
Well, I always think we are always entering into incredibly thorny moral territory and ethical territory when we do true crime. You know, and I have to say, I always have a little bit of that kind of moment of sort of the sleepless night. You know, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to kind of indulge my and maybe the audience's sort of morbid fascination in this story, you know, which we all have to kind of acknowledge we have, and what is my duty of care to the victims, you know.
There's a strong sort of public service impulse behind that film anyway, and those not familiar with it, the mother you saw there campaigned successfully for Sarah's Law, which, you know, forced the authorities to reveal the whereabouts of convicted predators, sexual predators, paedophile predators, and I think she read a book around the time of the film's release, and she wanted it out there. She did.
But with the amount of true crime, I mean, do you find that that's an issue?
Well,
so
I mean,
much an appetite for this?
I think Simon's right. Is that you by definition, by entering into this world, are you're taking on an incredible amount of responsibility. And you're hopefully going to do your very best. And if you work for a network, hopefully that network believes that it's very important to live by a very strict set of rules that the producers that you work with also live by. And, you know, fortunately, and I know a lot of companies are like this, A&E Networks has always taken it incredibly seriously. And so something like The First 48, where we film and have for 13 years, I think, with police departments as they're doing homicide investigations, which now isn't that big of a deal, but at the time hadn't been done, at least not in the United States, at the level we were doing it. And the reason that we continue to be able to do that is because we never forget that the victims are real people, someone got murdered, the police have to do their jobs to get justice done, and the suspects have rights too. So it's an incredible amount of responsibility, the amount of work that goes into every piece of that, including follow-up and that sort of thing, is a responsibility you take on if you go there. There are always going to be people who criticize what you do, and you have to be able to believe that you did your very best, and that if you maybe did make a mistake or that you need to change something, that you do that. And I think it's, but I think that the thing that I've been really happily the witness of a lot of times is that the family members want to participate because they want to do right by the memory of their family member. They want justice to be done. Police are grateful for the exposure of this type of stuff on television because a lot of times people in the community are much more willing to come forward with evidence, which they hadn't before. So it has, you know, it's a slippery slope and it's a dangerous place, but it has the potential to have a lot of positive on television.
I think you've got to have an ethical approach. I've turned down 2 films recently where the families weren't on board. Mm-hmm. You think that the family's attitude to the film is much more important than the film itself. On the other hand, you know, you do something like The Murder of Sadie Hartley, the family really wanted to be part of it. The Becky Watts story, the family really wanted to be part of it. You have to be mindful of victims. That it's sort of first and foremost, you know, whether we've made films in Broadmoor or whether we've made films in prison, and we're making more films in prison, there are always victims' issues, and you always have to handle that responsibly and feel that when you do, and it is thorny and it is a conundrum, but you have to be able to sort of feel that there is a clear conscience, and your work in the end, when it goes out, and you feel that actually the families would be with you and supporting this, and that's an important place to get to.
It's not always straightforward, and I think you are always navigating that tension. I remember with The Imposter, which is a film which in many ways actually suggests that the family of the missing boy, Nicholas Barclay, was sort of engaged in some sort of conspiracy or cover-up involving his death. I mean, it never explicitly states that, but you know, it could leave the audience with that impression. We never knew whether that was the case or not, hence we couldn't state it explicitly. We were kind of worried about that and about showing the family the film, which we felt we had to do before we launched it. And curiously, we showed the family the film, and they felt it was fair because in many ways they felt the film represented their perspective, which may have been different to other perspectives in the film, more fairly than other pieces of journalism about their stories. So that's kind of kind of interesting. But I still have a certain discomfort about that film and the kind of ethics therein.
Well, one of the reasons it's pretty well impossible to film in an English prison at the moment, according to the Justice Department, is concern for victims and their relatives. So you might interview or see, a convict who, and that even with the permission of the immediate relatives of the victim, that's not considered sufficient, because there might be someone else who is potentially traumatized by seeing
the
this
amount
perpetrator.
of due diligence that you have to do, but you have to do due diligence on. Obviously, this is the most sensitive form of due diligence, but we're actually going to be filming in a Scottish prison, and in Barlinnie with Ross Kemp. But I'm hopeful. I'd like to say I'm confident. I am confident in the programme makers, because I think they have sort of really worked hard to think about who's going to be in it and what the victims' issues are going to be, and have approached people. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into that. But we've got to sort of be brave and bold and go into these places and think, actually, okay, it involves more responsibility. Okay, we have to make sure that when the films are shown, the victims know about it. And, equally, you do a film about the fire brigade and Grenfell Tower, and you're so mindful of the victims' issues. It's not just in the crime area. We've got responsibility as programme makers across the board.
And I think in the way we tell those stories, and I think that we're moving on. And one of the things I wanted to explore a little bit was formatting, and how we move, whether it's from the first 48 onwards. Joe, you've got a new series called An Hour to Catch a Killer.
Yeah.
I think we've got a little taster
Somebody
for.
called it 24 Hours to Catch a Killer. And I thought, if only the fuck it was called 24 Hours to Catch a Killer, we'd have had longer.
I think the way we tell stories, that kind of the formatting of crime, I think is something that we're really is interesting. So perhaps we can.
Can I just caveat this to say this is the original taster.
Okay.
The film itself isn't ready. It's hopefully very good. And we couldn't show it in Edinburgh, but it'll show, I think maybe people have seen it even last year, but it'll show what whetted our appetite about this approach to crime and thinking about a format. The clock is ticking. Oh.
So what was important about having a very clear wrapper around that with this Hour to Catch a Killer, rather than a straight detectives type?
Well, I think everyone wants to find a returnable way into output on a mainstream broadcaster without ever losing, as I said before, the sort of special, unique quality of each story. And this story that we've got for the season is an extraordinary, unique case. But I think what appealed to us about The Hour to Catch a Killer is that it's a format that's grown. It's authentic. It grows, it's organic. There is something that the police use called the murder manual. And in the murder manual, it outlines on page whatever it is, I haven't read it in incredible detail, the murder manual, I will sort of tomorrow night. But there is a sort of rule called the golden hour rule, that you have to collect all the evidence within the golden hour in order to be as assured as possible of a successful conviction. So that grows from the real space, and for me, a format that so perfectly complements the content and the reality of the world in which the police are operating felt like a magic formula.
So it's authenticity that's important.
Sorry?
So it's authenticity and integrity.
Important.
So Chris, when your development team are dreaming up crime ideas for the broadcasters, for Laura, for whoever, how much are you thinking about how that's packaged now?
Well, we're only too aware that broadcasters want returnable formats, and so do we, frankly, because that's where the money is, and it's a hell of a lot easier to get recommissioned for a format than it is for a one-off, for obvious reasons. So, yes, we're thinking about that. But I think as a business, we're a company with a lot of journalistic firepower. I think that's our sort of USP, and we always really start with the story. So we want to find the best stories. So I think we often find ourselves sort of retrofitting a format onto the stories, which may sound a bit odd, but it has worked. I mean, that Sarah Payne story was one of a sequence of films that we made with a sort of loose format title, What Happened Next, and it wasn't really a format as such, but it was a sort of conceptual idea.
Way of looking at the story.
More like an anthology. I think that's where we often end up, with sort of anthologies rather than formats. That said, our US output is very heavily formatted, so we have a series with ID called Chris Hansen, Killer Instinct, which is A, presenter-led, but B, quite formulaic in its approach.
And is that really important for you, Laura? I mean, is that something that is really high on your list?
Well, there's a range. I mean, when we first developed the first 48, 2003, it was based on the fact that if you don't get a lead in the first 48 hours of a criminal investigation, of a homicide investigation, your odds of solving the case go down 50%. Now, at the time, we thought the more compelling piece was that we got this access to behind the tape. The thing that has sustained to this day, and 400 episodes later, is the fact that it's based on that authentic measurement and statistic, and that's what we build the show based on. So I think that those are harder in ways to come by because they kind of have been done to a certain degree. So whether we're talking about A&E in the U.S., which is a general entertainment network, so the crime on that channel, there are big formats like 60 Days In and Live PD that are not in the same type of whodunit model. They're kind of the different subgenres of crime. When we're looking at our crime investigation networks around the world, those really clear, sustainable formats are great. When we're developing an idea, though, which usually starts with a piece of access or a great story, I think it's similar to what Chris is describing. That is that we're not imposing a heavy format on something, but we are trying to structure it so that there's a sense of this is the type of journey you're going on, and then there's something for the audience to come back for a fresh version of, and that's sort of what we try to crack, because that we can do in many different countries and it travels well. So
I think it's very difficult to sort of construct a sort of pure crime show. I mean, 60 Days In is a great example, but it is sort of crime adjacent.
Absolutely.
It's much more about the justice system and, penal reform or whatever.
Right.
But the idea of these successful quote-unquote formats,
right.
What makes them successful is actually that they're not constructed.
I'm imagining that the golden hour is a sort of conceptual notion. You're not literally just filming the first hour of every crime.
Based on the critical hour in medicine.
It's based on the critical hour. The police themselves, they own it, and it is conceptual. And that allows you to go with the documentary flow, because in the end, content and story, as we know, is king. And sometimes, as Chris says, you can be story-led, and then you can corral it into the what happened next, or the, prisons, this prison this week, another prison another week, or whatever it is. You can find the connection between the stories, and then you can create the brand that way, which is what you're saying.
It's about, I guess, giving the audience a framework that they want to come back to, right?
Yeah.
As a commissioning editor, I once bought, I think, 200 shows of a series called Arrest and Trial, a Dick Wolf format. Fantastic show. And it was really simple. It was like about 22 minutes long. First 11 minutes was a crime, a reconstructed crime. The next 11 minutes was the televised courtroom proceedings of that case. That's it. And they found 200 odd different cases, and it was a winner for us.
Well, the drama, Law and Order, is, law and order. Well, that's what it is. And so you only need a sort of simplicity, conceit to get, okay, that's a drama example, but you only need a simple conceit, and I think people work really, really hard and think about the formats, and because broadcasters are ghastly people, and they say, oh, come on, bring us a format, and bring us another format. But actually what we're saying is bring us fantastic content, and then think imaginatively about how to extrapolate from that content and give it something that just could stand out and could potentially return. It doesn't mean to say, I mean, the murder of Sadie Hartley was a singular and 90-minute event on ITV that did incredibly well. One is always guarded about saying a story about somebody dying does well, but anyway. But that was sort of serendipitous. It came out of a series of police access. That story happened within the police jurisdiction. The closeness of the access that the filmmakers had got allowed them to follow the trail of this story from it kicking off to the very end of conviction. And, you know, you're not going to turn down a story.
I mean, we're having a lot of success with feature-length crime. That seems to be, I mean, Simon, your kind of movie background. Do you think that the feature-length film is something that now is much more accepted by the big audience, the TV audience?
Yeah, it seems to be. Still quite a high bar because, you know, 90 minutes is a long time to sort of sustain an audience and a narrative. I think crime isn't actually weirdly a kind of category that I sort of necessarily sort of obviously always gravitate to for cinema docs. You know, that there are sort of some notable successes, I guess, you know, Capturing the Freedmans and, you know, I guess Central Park 5. You know, there are a handful of films that I can reference. I mean, I think actually really it is TV that is sort of leading the way in sort of long form crime, for want of a better term. Sometimes the kind of the feature length, but I guess I think more often the kind of everyone's sort of looking for the sort of
and the big story, finding the big story,
single story that can kind of play out over really as long as it's possible to sustain the story. I think sometimes the examples of the successes in this area, I think we can debate about length, whether they really do sustain. I mean, Making a Murderer, 10 hours. Yeah. It was a huge success. So you know.
And doesn't want to cut.
I think
I whizzed through the last three. Actually.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big question of would you come back? Would you have come back for 10 weeks in a row if it was a single slot? And that's nothing to denigrate that show, but that series. But there is something about the ability to just watch it at your own kind of leisure and sort of slow down when you want to slow down and speed up when you want to speed up. And I think that's.
I guess that form does lend itself to sort of non-linear television.
Yeah.
So let's talk about one of your projects, Laura, the Lacey Peterson story. Can we run that clip and then perhaps we can chat about that? So tell us the background to that story and what excited you about it.
Well, the story itself it involved a young woman who was due to give birth very soon. She's married to Scott Peterson, Lacey Peterson, and she disappears on Christmas Eve. And unfortunately, she ultimately does not survive, nor does the child. And he is found. He's suspected immediately and essentially tried by the media, and then he goes to prison, is on death row. I shouldn't say covered, but I was at the network when the case first happened, and we did a very quick turnaround documentary about the case, and it did really seem. I mean, it was all circumstantial evidence, but it did look. You know, he behaved in a very suspicious way. It turned out the reason he was behaving suspiciously was that he had been having an affair, and he didn't want people to. Now, by the way, I'm not saying he didn't do it because I don't know, but this investigation, which is 6 hours, is a retelling of the crime story for those who don't know the case, but is, as I think you might have said on the phone, or Joe said earlier, sorry, not on the phone, that when you look at a case many years later, you often get people participating and cooperating and sharing their points of view when they didn't when it first happened. So we've got everything from reporters to investigators to family members who have their thoughts on and their memories of the investigation and where things are now. And there were some big pieces of evidence that never made it into the courtroom in terms of a burglary that was happening across the street the morning that Lacey disappeared, that she confronted the burglars, and these people were never questioned. And so what this story is as much about is not just, is this a miscarriage of justice or may he be innocent? It's really about the media. It's a real conversation with the media and about the media, but it includes the media in their impressions of it. So it has a lot more dimensions than it just being a straight crime story, which is the reason, sort of past that bar for us is why would we do this story again? What's new? And what is there to share with the audience? And so it sort of serves on both levels. You may never have known the story before, and if you do, there's a lot of new material.
Because you're doing 6 hours,
Yep.
that's a lot on one case.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole current trend of pulling out the skin, taking the skin off the onion of one case. I mean, do you think, how are you going to schedule it? How's it going to work?
It's it's airing now, and we have A&E has always had a very strong commitment to crime programming and the whole kind of gamut of crime programming. And so Thursday nights, this is in the U.S. Thursday nights have been the crime night for almost 20 years, I think, so maybe longer. And so that creates this sort of ability to do this week to week experience, even though I think there was some nervousness about, is that going to sustain? I think that having been on the receiving side of lots of pitches over the last 20 years, once Serial happened, everyone decided that what used to be maybe 10 minutes of an episode about something became a 6-hour or a 10-hour series. And so I think we all probably have to deal with this process of is there enough meat on the bone to really dig into that, and is that going to be a satisfying experience, and how do you carry that over from week to week?
And you don't want to be seduced. I mean, what the experiences on different platforms are the experiences on different platforms, and people go to Netflix or to podcasts for something different, and sometimes they bought into that service. And that's their time and that box set binge. But sometimes you just think, actually, you've got to do something different on the linear platform. And you can give them they're serving a long prison sentence, if you like, on the Netflix thing in the best possible way. And we might be giving them a short, sharp shock of a sort of 3-part event. So I think that, and another way, actually, of creating that sort of sense of presence in your schedule is, I suppose, what we're doing is to create a season. So it's not saying that we need 6 parts. I mean, there is The Investigator coming back through Current Affairs, which is a long-form documentary series around one cold case with Mark Williams-Thomas. But, on the whole, if you create a season of films, you can corral that content and make it feel bigger than the sum of its parts.
But with the big 6-parters, there seems to be a desire to have some sort of big revelation to reveal, and certainly with the Jinx there was a lot of controversy about how that was revealed. And whether filmmakers are holding back what is important information for the sake of great figures. Simon, in terms of...
Yeah, in a way I sort of admired that series in the sense that I thought it was kind of just a brilliantly crafted piece of storytelling. And yes, we can debate the ethics of that particular point. I was less comfortable, I have to be honest, with Making a Murderer, which I think in a sense sort of really sort of foregrounded this apparent miscarriage of justice in a way to sort of hook the audience in and sort of propel the narrative forward and give it a kind of real sense of purpose. And then at the end of when it came out, there was a lot of controversy from members of the police force and others about stuff that kind of was left on the cutting room floor that would not have served that particular agenda and probably diminished in some way in the filmmaker's mind the thing that made it propulsive. But my real discomfort was actually that them coming out in the press afterwards and denying that they were engaged in a piece of sort of advocacy journalism, and saying that actually that they had no agenda and that they felt that their film or their series was absolutely journalistically balanced rather than just kind of coming clean. I actually personally feel that it would have benefited from being a little bit more ambiguous, I think, but that is my particular taste. And
But I think to go back to your point, and I think that's fair, you know, about revelation. Revelation isn't just the sort of answer to a whodunit. So if Gordon Ramsay goes on the cocaine trail and discovers coke in a host of West End restaurants and then goes into the jungle to find out how it's made and adulterated through an illegal cooking process that looks incredibly like something I might cook in my kitchen, really horrible, but, you know, extraordinary. That's revelatory. People don't know that. If sort of a Ross Kemp goes into a prison, he's been into dangerous places, he's not been into a UK prison, so it's both a revelation for him and it's revelatory to see how prison works, and it's our job to find something new in that.
I do think there's a distinction though between revealing how things work and revealing who killed somebody. And I think, to me, the crux of the issue is there's a lot of risk associated with cold cases or unsolved cases or contested cases. They are effectively a kind of form of current affairs.
Well, let's take that point, Chris, and look at a clip from Interview with the Murderer, because I think, you know, in a way, that was a very interesting sort of turning on its head of a story. So perhaps we can play that clip, please.
Barbara Rybold made those statements,
yes,
and as you know, I've tracked down those statements, and you were there when I asked her, could she say that she was there all afternoon and was able to verify that you were there all afternoon? And she can't. She can't guarantee what times you may have left Corbett Hospital all afternoon. Means that you don't have a cast iron alibi. That alibi is, well, it disappears, but...
I accept what you say. I don't have now a cast iron alibi. Do you have any evidence that I killed Carl Bridgewater? If you do, sir, bring it forward. If you don't, shut your mouth. OK? You've now annoyed me.
Yes, you don't want to be annoyed, don't want to annoy Bert Spencer. It's a very nasty piece of work. Yeah, I think that's a case in point, because this was just basically a kind of cat and mouse film, really. A guy that we thought was had originally been a suspect, then was cleared. 4 guys got convicted of that killing, and 20 years later, unfortunately, having served half a life in prison, they were cleared too. So we went back to the original suspect, who fortunately is a sort of a narcissist as well as possibly a psychopath. And he cooperated. He like a lot of narcissists, he believes he's cleverer than everyone else, and so he was willing to be interviewed over a long period of time. And there was a sort of joust as we tried to kind of catch him out, essentially. But we never caught him out in interview, but we found out 2 or 3 things almost by accident in the course of making the film that really did catch him out and led to the reopening of the case. It's still open at the moment. But that was pure chance, in a way. I mean, I'd like to claim the credit for, you know, I think Rick and David, hopefully, are in this room. They had the persistence, the detective-like hunger to try and prove that Bert did it. But even they would accept that, you know, a week before we delivered that film, his first wife spoke out for the first time in 35 years and basically nailed him, or tried to nail him. That was a piece of good fortune. But we were lucky to get that commission because it was open-ended. We just said, we might prove that this guy had done it, we might not. And it turned out better than we expected. But that's the risk of not holding back stuff. If you manipulate the story, then you can kind of manage the tension.
But the not knowing the outcome. Audiences are very sophisticated. Yes, of course, you want cut and dried resolution and all credit to that team, you know, for their persistence. But it's interesting, in the series that I've got coming up in Crime and Punishment, Piers has sort of promised the victims of a man who's in prison, who's already confess to the murder of 13 women, mainly, but withdrawn the confession, that he will go on the trail and get this man to confess. I don't know if you've got time to show the clip.
I haven't, but...
it's really interesting. It's a cat and mouse game. What happens at the end is revelatory, but it's not conclusive. And I think that we don't have to be so reductive about what revelation means and entails.
But we're in terms of, I think, also social media, and the creating of a moment is a really interesting thing, that these crime shows are now, because of the way people look at them online, the way that the Netflix is working, that we're actually creating a moment in kind of cultural moment with something like Making of a Murderer. And I think that the whole sort of box set viewing, all that. Simon, you've been doing a big piece for Netflix, which is slightly different in terms of what its subject's coming from. But again, it's trying to package it in that way, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a weird one, this, because, I mean, I guess maybe this was a series with a category problem, because I never really saw it as a crime show. It was actually a series called Captive, series of 8 individual films about different hostage crises around the world, where our focus was very much on the sort of negotiation, the sort of moral murkiness of how those negotiations took place. It was much more, for me, always a sort of psychological drama than a sort of, thriller or crime or mystery. So it didn't have many of the tropes of sort of classic crime, and it certainly wasn't serialized. But nevertheless, there was a sort of desire on Netflix's part, clearly, to sort of place it in that category, and to sort of, give it the Making a Murderer slot, which was, it actually came out a year after Making a Murderer. And so, in some way, in terms of the press that we did, everyone was sort of comparing it to Making a Murderer in a way that I really never felt that comfortable with, because I thought, in a way, Making a Murderer had something that this didn't. It was an anthology series. It should probably be compared to something like Black Mirror, much more than Making a Murderer.
Well, let's have a little bit of a clip from it.
But it was positioned as a crime show.
You went to the police and told them lies?
I didn't go to the police and tell them lies.
So it is the truth?
You just want someone to say, do you know what, I believe you.
She's very much likely to fall in the hands of the prosecution so they can scrutinise her evidence and tear it apart.
That does not make me someone who is abusive to children, because I'm not. If they think that, then they think we're monsters.
So take us through a little bit of that, what the reason for doing that series, and what were you driven by?
Well, I guess mainly for me it was just a fascination in this, sort of, as I said, this kind of moral tension at the heart of every hostage crisis, or many hostage crises, where the government or the authorities don't want to pay ransom, they don't want to set that precedent, but the families on the other hand are desperate to do whatever it takes to get their loved ones out, and the kind of the drama that creates, that for me was, I guess, my way in.
So it's sort of multiple narratives.
But it's also to sort of try and, kind of cover the world, sort of tell stories that were global in many different areas of sort of crime and conflicts, and actually that in a way was the thing that Netflix really bought into, and the idea that we could kind of get into the minds of the hostage takers and what their strategy was, and that actually felt particularly pertinent to terrorism, actually. So a number of terrorism stories in there, which I guess you're sort of more political than criminal. But then there were some pure crime stories. There was a great episode we did about this Brazilian hostage taker who's basically just after cash, and we told the story really principally from his point of view, as well as his victims. which I think was kind of, again, another sort of real selling point for Netflix. But whether, as I said, whether this could be, I mean, some of the shows feel absolutely within the crime genre and others don't. Maybe that was a...
So is there pressure, you think, from broadcasters to try and create these kind of moments, these kind of big... One
of the things that's really changed was that, you know, there was a time when we wouldn't want to give something, we wouldn't want to give away sort of the reveal, you know, in the more literal sense of what a reveal was. So the deal with the promo department was that you can't give away how it turns out. And now that's actually how you promote stuff, because people will still watch it. That's not a reason not to watch it. It gives them the reason to watch it, cuts through the clutter, that sort of thing. So,
because I think people are interested in how you get to the reveal as well.
Yeah.
There's a fascination in process as well, and how things work and how systems work. And so I think that you can give away the reveal in those cases and still...
And the authenticity. I mean, I remember really wanted to buy your show, Captive, but I blame others for why we didn't. But anyway, what really struck me about that one was that you had of course you always have to have the point of view of the victim, but there's always the nuance of, well, how do you give the voice to the bad guy, so to speak. And from a hostage-taking standpoint, you never hear that point of view. And that, to me, was so striking about that, to really hear that they... it's approached in this very business-like sort of way, sometimes with a code of sort of ethics, and it was really interesting.
They're doing it for kind of often, but understandable, you know, if not entirely legitimate reasons.
So we're running out of time, but I think it still feels like the true crime genre and also kind of new ways of these kind of complicated, long narratives is alive and well. Is there any questions from the audience for the last couple of minutes? Somebody over here, I think.
I'm really interested in the fact that you about like the golden age of true crime.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm really interested in the idea of like the golden age of true crime and the ethics behind it. It feels like meta filmmaking is kind of a big part of a lot of the new series, where you get to understand the fact that filmmakers have an agenda and they're sort of in front of the camera sometimes, or they're doing the narration. What do you think that relationship is with things that maybe seem more traditional, where it's very much like a, here are some facts that we lay out, and you don't really see the kind of storytelling in front of the camera?
I think it's really great to have a mixture of both. We use it on ITV, we're a mainstream channel, and we use presenters, if that's what you're talking about, often immersed in the narrative structure, so that you get a sort of duality of experience. You get them sort of going on, I hate the word on a journey, but on a sort of metaphorical journey, if you like, and going through something and mediating it for us and going through some emotional experience. And you get the narrative of the film itself, and sometimes that's the best way. I mean, the Carl Bridgewater thing, you needed David Wilson, serial killer, which got coming up. You need Piers Morgan. The Mafia, you need that sort of weird combination of Trevor Gentleman that we did, Gentleman Trevor, and these sort of notorious, unthinkable killers. So sometimes it can create a frisson in its own right, and a journalistic purpose. Sometimes it's not appropriate. So I think we've got to have a sort of mixed ecology. There's no sort of one rule fits all.
But yeah, what excites me most of all is the stuff that feels like it's sort of turning the dial on the genre, you know, and exposing, you know, maybe the journalistic process. You know, the Jinx is a great example of a film which sort of starts as one thing and ends up as something entirely different, because the guy behind the camera sort of steps out in front of the camera, and you realise there's something else going on that propels you forward. And OJ, which I referenced earlier, sort of brings all sorts of layers and textures to a genre, you know, to sort of explain the world in a way, you know. And I think it's a great genre because it has narrative propulsion at the heart of it. But I think the interesting stuff is taking that and doing different things.
And it's almost the one genre where sort of truth is stranger than fiction, and you know, and where the sort of the ability to convey real drama is there in spades. So long live true crime. On cue.
That's it.
That's my play.
Are there any more questions?
Taking off without me.
Are there any more questions? Because I think our time is up. Any more? If not, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank our panel, for Simon, Joe, Chris and Laura. Thank you very much. Don't have nightmares. Thank you.